Thanks for the download. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever platform you're listening on, as this is the best way of bringing it to new listeners. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production costs to the minimum. My guest today is Colin Freeman, a journalist with nearly 30 years of experience. Colin began his career in local papers, moving through the tabloids and the London Evening Standard, before becoming a chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph. His extensive career has taken him to numerous war zones and global hotspots, including Iraq, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring revolutions, and the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Colin also covered the Somali piracy crisis, during which he was kidnapped and held at gunpoint for 6 weeks. More recently, he's been covering the war in Ukraine for the past 3 years as a freelancer for the Daily Telegraph, and it was during this time he conceived the idea for his book, The Mad and the Brave, the untold story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion. In this episode, we'll delve into the fascinating and often harrowing world of foreign volunteers fighting in Ukraine. Colin's book explores the diverse motivations that drive these individuals to drop their civilian lives and join a conflict unlike any other seen in Europe since World War II. We discuss everything from those defending democracy and seeking personal redemption to the Walter Mittys totally unprepared for the realities of war. Colin shares insights into challenges of reporting from Ukraine, including the embedded system and the inherent dangers of the front lines. He also reveals the chaos and disorganization within the International Legion during its early days, the issues of unqualified individuals and vetting failures, and how these internal challenges sometimes pose a greater threat than the enemy. We also discussed the horrific accounts of torture and psychological manipulation faced by captured foreign volunteers in Russian captivity. Colin reflects on the difficult readjustment process for returning volunteers, highlighting issues like PTSD, the lack of understanding from civilians, and the absence of official support systems for those who fight without government backing. We explore the complex paradox of foreign volunteers risking their lives while some Ukrainians leave the country, and discuss the perceived impact of the foreign fighters on the war. Finally, Colin offers his perspective on the future of the war in Ukraine and suggests changes he believes could maximise the Legion's effectiveness. Let's crack on. Colin, great to see you, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hello, nice to see you.
As normal, we're going to start off with, if you could just give listeners an overview of your journalistic career and the war zones you've been to prior to reporting on Ukraine.
Yes, so I've been a reporter for nearly about 30 years now. I started off on local papers on the Grimsby Evening Telegraph. I was there for a couple of years. Always wanted to move on, though, to Fleet Street, like most people do, start their careers on local newspapers. My stepping stone was working on a tabloid news agency in London, doing a lot of celebrity doorsteps and court cases and crime and so on. Sort of fairly rough-hewn, foot-in-the-door journalism. News agencies often are used by mainstream big newspapers to do the jobs that they don't want to be associated with. I often used to say, if you work for the Sun or the News of the World or any of these tabloids, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, there was not much that a war zone was going to be able to throw at you that you wouldn't have seen already. Also, in war zones, reporters are part of the landscape. There as our soldiers and medics and aid workers, and people expect to see you there in a way that they don't always expect to see you knocking on their door on a Sunday morning to ask them about some scandalous aspect of their private life or whatever. Did that for a couple of years, didn't like it, I should be clear. Then I worked on the London Evening Standard for about 4 years. That was good. Big city newspaper, lots of different stuff going on. Became fairly clear to me fairly early on I was never going to be one of the star reporters. I was never going to get to be one of the people who was going to get sent to cover a war anywhere like that or do any of the really big international stories. And so when the war in Iraq came along, and as you you may remember that there was quite a lot of lead up to it. And it was one of these relatively unusual wars where it seemed pretty obvious that this was going to happen. And, we had large numbers of British and American forces moving out to the Gulf in advance of it. And it seemed to be very much a fait accompli. And so at the time, the Standard was choosing a team of reporters to go and cover the war. And I thought, this is obviously I'm not going to be part of that team. This is the first really big story of my generation. And here I'm going to be stuck back in London writing about commuter delays and roadworks and things like that. I was actually stuck on a celebrity doorstep for the Standard one day, and a photographer colleague said, when I was whining on about not getting to go to the war, he said, well, why don't you just go as a freelance? To cut a long story that's short, that's what I did. It was just like a light bulb going off in my mind. I thought it would be a bit like backpacking around the world, only with a bit of a difference, a bit more kind of adventure and so on, a bit more purpose. Other people did not see it that way. They sort of said, look, you've got no contacts, you don't speak Arabic, nobody wants you to work out there, you'll have no insurance, you'll probably get killed and all that. So it was a bit of a leap in the dark, to put it mildly. A bit like, the leap in the dark that a lot of the volunteers take in the book. But anyway, I did duly go out there. I got there the day the war ended officially, which was 3 weeks after the invasion. Which is not a great thing to have in your cap as a war reporter. You were there on the day the war ended. But as many of your listeners will probably know, the invasion of Iraq went like clockwork. It was the occupation afterwards that was where the problems started. And that was where the story really was. So I ended up there on and off for more or less 2 years. I had a flat in Baghdad. That was my first sort of major opportunity to cover a war, or at least an insurgency on steroids, really, as it was. So I was there till the early part of 2005, so a couple of years. Spent most of the time up in Baghdad and around, sometime down in Basra, covering the activities of the British down there. Then the longer things went on there, the more dangerous it got. A lot of my colleagues, about half a dozen of them, were kidnapped, some by Al-Qaeda. It was the beginning of that, that tactic where, open season was declared on aid workers and journalists as well, who'd previously enjoyed a bit of a protection as perceived neutral parties. So I came back to London. I was invited back to London by the Sunday Telegraph, for whom I'd started working as a stringer out in Baghdad. And they made me chief foreign correspondent, chief of only one other, I should point out, based in London, covering big international stories around the world. A dream job, really. And so I covered a lot of big international stories since then. Did most of the Arab Spring, so the revolutions in Libya and Syria and Egypt. Did the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014. Visited Iran, Afghanistan, basically all the other trouble spots around the world. The Armenia-Azerbaijan war a few years ago. Also the Somali piracy crisis. For my pains, got kidnapped in Somalia while covering the piracy crisis by a bunch of pirates. Good research exercise, really. And spent 6 weeks in a cave being at gunpoint, being held at gunpoint by a group of pirates, which was not a very nice experience, but sadly the kind of thing that a lot of reporters have to endure these days. It's kind of become a bit of an occupational hazard now that we are seen as fair game as well. And then more recently, I've been covering the war in Ukraine for the last 3 years as a freelancer for the Daily Telegraph. I was made redundant by them in 2016, but I've carried on working for them on and off. It's generally easier to work for people you've worked with before. And it was while in Ukraine that I got the idea for doing the book on the International Legion and the foreign volunteers.
In the Vietnam War, you could basically hitch a ride in a helicopter, go out, get in with the frontline troops, and virtually go anywhere. And many photojournalists and journalists did exactly that. One of the things that the Brits took away from Vietnam was that the fact that uncontrolled journalism could be a bad thing for morale back home. And you saw in the Falklands War that journalism started to be more controlled. I'd like a brief insight into how is it run in Ukraine when you rock up there as a journalist, as a freelancer? Is there any control over what you can report on? Is there like an embedded structure like you sometimes have in Western armies? How does it work out there?
Yes, there is an embedded structure in the same way as you have that you had in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I did quite a few embeds there. And certainly, the experience of being with the British Army in Iraq was that the embeds were very controlled, and you went where they said you could go. If you specified a particular place that you were interested in, they would often say no, even if you had made the efforts with it was a commander that you had kind of got to know and who you felt who had made it clear that they would be happy to have you there. The British MOD spin doctors would often veto it. It was sort of similar, more relaxed on the American side, actually, generally speaking. But anyway, comparing that to Ukraine, the Ukrainians have adopted that similar embed system, and they control access to the front lines, generally speaking. I mean, these are grown-up front lines anyway, so they're not places that it is advisable to be straying into as a freelance just driving around in your car, because you're as likely to get fired upon by the Ukrainians as anybody else. As a soldier, you'll know that if you see some civilian car driving down a road and you're not sure who it is, then that can be quite a big deal. And most of the incidents where journalists come unstuck are usually doing that sort of thing, probing around independently on the front line. But the Ukrainians, I think there is a slight advantage for us as reporters in that their different units all have different press officers who all have different approaches. Some are quite controlling. Others are very, very devil-may-care, and can actually, your main risk probably is that they take you somewhere that's really dangerous. You really don't know what you're going to get, but there is a variety of them. I would also say that because they're actually fighting a much more superior army, they don't have quite the opportunities to control your minute movements to control the access to the battlefield that the Brits do. But generally speaking, we've not had too much difficulty in getting to see people. That they have introduced rules about not having anyone there for more than a day at a time. It's hard to get overnight stays now. But having said that, the Ukrainians have a lot of their units are volunteer units, even though they're incorporated formally into the Ukrainian army. And they have a sense of, we will do what we want. So it's not unheard of for reporters to get access to a unit for several days at a time. They are quite controlling about when you release footage and, releasing locations and other militarily sensitive details. But I would not particularly say it's been a disaster from a reporting point of view at all, no.
So the International Legion for the Defence of Ukraine, or the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, is a military unit of the Ukrainian Ground Forces composed of foreign volunteers. It was created on 27th of February 2022 by the Ukrainian government at the request of President Volodymyr Zelensky to fight against the Russian invasion of the country. It was originally part of the Territorial Defence Forces under the name of International Legion of Territorial Defence of Ukraine, eventually transitioning to the command of the Ukrainian Ground Forces. United 24 Media reported on the 4th of August that Ukraine's armed forces now include volunteers from 72 countries, with nearly 40% of them coming from South America, highlighting the growing international presence in its defence efforts. Foreign volunteers now arrive at a rate of around 600 per month, up from just 100 to 150 monthly in 2022, thanks in large part to the establishment of a foreign recruitment centre that even covers travel costs. To date, over 8,000 foreign nationals have joined the ground forces, suggesting the overall number across all branches may be twice that. Many recruits bring prior military experience, while others are motivated by the opportunity to defend freedom and sharpen their skills. So the contribution, motivations and impact of these volunteers is explored in your book. So what made you write The Mad and the Brave, the untold story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion?
Partly it was to explore the different motivations of these volunteers, as well as actually capture their experiences on the battlefield, because often they have backstories that are remarkable about what makes them suddenly drop what they're doing in normal civilian life back in Britain or America or elsewhere, and volunteer for a conflict that is unlike anything we have seen since World War II. and also a conflict where they are the underdogs, where they are fighting a superpower, the Russian army, that has got all the aces in terms of air power, in terms of firepower, in terms of manpower, that's got nuclear weapons, drones, all the latest kit, and also is not a superpower that particularly plays by the rules either, where if you get caught by the Russians or you go up against the Russians, you cannot expect them to play by the Geneva Convention. So it's an extraordinary thing for people to want to be willing to do in the first place. So I wanted to look at why people would do that. And that is partly why one part of the book is called The Mad and the Brave, because a lot of the people who have gone out there, if they've got one thing in common, it is that their friends and family, peers, comrades, whatever, just said, like, you are crazy. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? They would get their mental health questioned. Their motivations might well be very pure. We need to go out and defend democracy. But when it came to telling their nearest and dearest about that, their nearest and dearest would often say, well, yes, but do you have to really? That you may well end up getting killed. And so that side of it was certainly something I wanted to look into, the motivational side, but also just as a way of providing a narrative of the war. I thought it would be a good way of doing it as well, because although we do have a lot of interest in the war here in the UK, the media coverage is quite big comparatively, and interest in the war is considerable. I thought that you would be able to engage British readers or Western readers more if you doing an account of the war as seen through the eyes of fellow Westerners, i.e. John from Scotland or Dave from London or Bill from California or whatever. And also just from a practical point of view as a journalist, it's a lot easier interviewing people who speak your own language. I don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. People who are from the UK, for example, will be able to describe things with a vividness and sense of reference, frames of reference that are likely to make a much more engaging read than if you're interviewing Ukrainians through an interpreter. I know this because I've used interpreters a lot over the years, including for previous books, and it slows things up a lot. It's a lot more expensive and complex. For those reasons alone, it's just the practical reasons, it makes more sense. So those are the reasons essentially that I wanted to do, and also just to provide people with a book that they could read about the first couple of years of the war, with mainly ideally picking volunteers who could narrate the major highlights, like the siege of Kiev, the war in the Donbass, the chaos of the early days, and then the grind of the sort of established front lines, the terror of dealing with drones, and really just every aspect of the combat, so that people don't just get a book about the volunteers, but also a book that gives some sort of rounded account of the war for the first couple of years, with a bit of interwoven narrative about the politics and
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was a professional soldier for 22 years, and I think it was Patton that said, it's not about dying for your country, it's making the other son of a bitch die for his. What is weird here is this isn't your country. So one of the reasons I wanted to read your book and speak to you is that whole thing about this whole motivation. And I remember in the early days, there was I think it was an American guy who'd served a couple of tours in Afghanistan. And he said, if you've served in Afghanistan, you're coming out here, Afghanistan is a walk in the park compared to what we're going to see out here. And this will become clearer later on. The introduction to your book notes that it's based on conversations with volunteers during the war's first 3 years. And you mentioned that some accounts went on for hours, sometimes with tears. Could you share how you approach these deeply personal and often traumatic conversations to ensure you capture the experiences while respecting the privacy and the sensitivity of the subject matter?
These are not the kind of interviews that I was doing in my old tabloid days, or the kind of interviews you do for any newspapers where you maybe ring somebody up or approach somebody on the street on a doorstep or something. Most of these interviews were, things where I would either bump into a volunteer serving in Ukraine, in a cafe or in a bar or on a front line somewhere, or staying in a hotel sometimes, or I would reach out to people on social media and I would say, look, I'm writing a book. I would be interested to sort of speak to you about your experiences. And we'd sort of arrange it all in advance. Yeah, a lot of them are quite suspicious of journalists and journalism generally. That's true of most military people. So you sort of try to put them at their ease. You set out who you are, what it is you're hoping to get from the interviews. I quite often tell them, give them an idea, a rough idea of the sort of questions I want to ask them in advance. Because this is not gotcha journalism like you see on TV, where you're trying to catch people out. Basically, what you're trying to do is to encourage them to open up about their own experiences on the battlefield. And also sometimes if you offer questions up in advance, it gives them a bit of time to think. Like if you ask somebody out of the blue, were there any funny moments when you were out there? They often think, oh, sorry, I'll have to get back to you, because they're not expecting questions like that. So you give them a bit of a chance to prep in advance and get them to relax, really. Yeah, it often takes several hours, though, to even just cover a few months of the war while they're fighting, because battlefields are incredibly complex places. It's a bit like somebody discussing a football match, So I was here, and so was there, and then there was a Russian here, and then this missile came in there, and then you're busy struggling to actually, you're trying to form a mental picture of what is going on, and it is really, really hard without actually getting people to plot every single thing that they're talking about. You get them to draw maps, you get them to draw diagrams and so on, but it's a long and painstaking procedure. And then also, a lot of them a lot of these people do have kind of quite troubled personal lives. A lot of them have had tough upbringings, tough family lives, and they're sometimes quite often in volunteering for Ukraine. They're running away, or they're trying to deal with problems in their past lives and seeking through the war to give their lives a bit more of a sense of purpose. So quite often there are areas that they may not want to talk about too much. Generally speaking, I am a bit of a nosy bastard, to be honest. So I'm usually fairly candid with them. I just say, look, I'm going to ask you lots of questions. It's up to you what you answer and what you don't. But, don't be surprised if I ask you some sensitive
Do you have
stuff.
a good bullshit detector? Because you've been in war zones, you're used to mingling with soldiers, and these type of conflicts can often attract Walter Mittys characters. Was that a concern that you might end up with somebody who'd be trying to pull the wool over your eye?
Yeah, it is. And what you tend to try and, with the Walter Mittys, it's usually fairly easy to tell, because they will say something that is verifiably untrue. Like they'll say, I won the Victoria Cross for this or that. And I Google most people, and I do a bit of background research on them just to sort of find out whether there's anything in their past that perhaps preclude them from being in the book. You try and sort of verify some details. Generally speaking, in terms of the bullshit detector, it's a case of listening to the general gist of their conversation. If their accounts of events are often a bit complicated, a little bit meandering, and full of cock-ups and battles that have dead ends and things that didn't kind of quite go right, that's usually a sign that they're telling the truth. And you have to kind of just trust people to some extent. I would not claim, when I'm counting the volunteers' background stories, for example, am I getting everything? No. Most of them generally certainly some of them have given me a very warts and all account of their past lives, about how they've had brushes with the law and this kind of thing. And where possible, I've checked that. And so, sometimes I'm quite nosy. If someone says, I got a bit of trouble when I was young, I should say, what for? Got sent to jail, or really what for? And, I do push a bit. If they sort of clam up at that point, it can get a bit problematic. Generally speaking, most people don't. And those are the ones you sort of tend to go for in the first place. It's done a lot on gut feeling.
And you're used to mingling with soldiers, so you can probably tell just the way they carry themselves and the way they speak, terminology, that type of thing. Yes,
and occasionally some of the volunteers came kind of recommended or referred by other volunteers as well. Sometimes there's an instinct to sort of speak to other people that they know, and ask them, like, is such and such, is he a straight up person or not? You don't really want people to feel like you're vetting them. I did occasionally ask people when they were describing very contentious events to see if there's anybody else who could corroborate what they said. In all frankness, a lot of the accounts in the book, I was not there with them on the battlefield. There is a limit to how much verification I can do, really. And I think there are some words to that effect in the foreword, yeah.
In your book, you write, despite Zelensky saying that he only wanted those with military experience, all kinds of people were turning up. Many, by the looks of it, eminently unqualified for civilian life, let alone military life. Regular soldiers had nicknames for such characters: screamers, paintballers, Instagram warriors, people who'd watched too many episodes of SAS Who Dares Wins, who thought the Legion was going to be like an episode of the A-Team. You reveal a wide spectrum of motivations for joining the International Legion, from defending democracy, which we've already talked about, to seeking personal redemption or a sense of purpose. Which types of volunteers did you find most frequently, and were there any motivations that particularly surprised you during your research?
I think the majority of the volunteers, if I had to sort of paint a typical picture of them, they're not all ex-SAS or ex-Royal Marines, or, they're the kind of cream of the elite infantry units, which I suspect is perhaps what Volodymyr Zelensky was hoping to attract when he first created the Legion. A lot of them are people who perhaps have, they're out there for the right motivations. They wouldn't be getting involved in a civil war or an ethnic or religious war. They're not people who are just out there fighting for kicks. But there are personal reasons as well. Maybe home life is lacking a sense of purpose. But they're often kind of fairly lay soldiers, Royal Engineers, standard infantrymen, and so on. I think the motivations, the unusual motivations, are combating or sort of confronting post-traumatic stress, I think, is one of them, where they think that a battlefield was the last place that they would ever want to be again. Some of them, I think, relish the fact that they are on the right side of history for once. There are quite a few who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan who felt that, certainly I think with the Iraq war, that what's the point of being here? The people don't really like us, attacked all the time. We can't go out of our bases without facing a kidnap threat. And this is a chance to be amongst the people who appreciate having them there. The ones that I find most surprising, though, are the ones who've never fought before, because they do go there despite lots of people saying to them, look, you've got no business here. You're absolutely mad. Not least, including their friends and family, but other people too. And I mean, there's a guy in the book, Douglas Cartner, who had never fought before, but he had wanted to serve in the army when he was young, but he'd not been allowed to for medical reasons, and I think he felt this was his one chance to achieve his dream. The way he played it was fairly canny, actually. He just said to people, look, I've not fought before. I don't claim to be any kind of expert on this. And to some extent, among the more experienced soldiers, I think they sort of thought, well, at least he's not some bullshitting Walter Mittys. At least he's upfront about that. And then I was fascinated to, well, how did you learn? How did you cope with the stress of it all? And he said a lot of it he just learned by watching YouTube lessons or YouTube people talking about how you do this, how you do that. There's a lot of soldiering techniques that are available now in a way, courtesy of the internet, that there wouldn't have been, 20 or 30 years ago. So he spent a lot of time doing that, basically, sort of self-taught, doing an online instruction course. And then I think when he joined the unit, I did ask him, well, how did you cope with the fear? That bit I'll never really understand quite how he coped with the artillery crashing around him in those first few weeks. He did say at one point that on his very first day on the front lines, he was pointing his, nobody told him what way the enemy were. So he pointed his machine gun one way, and then 5 soldiers wandered into view from a distance through some woodlands. He couldn't get decent eyes on them, and he's thinking, like, are these guys Ukrainians or are they Russians? And they're coming closer and closer. And they're in a sort of a patrolling formation. They're not looking relaxed. He reached a point where they were, only sort of 30 or 40 meters away. And he's thinking, well, I'm either going to have to open fire on these people, or they're going to spot me and they're going to open fire on me. And I think literally at the moment where he was about to shout a warning and fire a burst over their heads, he suddenly realized they were Ukrainians. That sort of crazy situation, I don't think anybody would normally expect, but that is the reality of the slightly chaotic battlefields that they face out there, especially when you don't speak the language, which is the other sort of really big difficulty. But he basically said that in terms of answering the central question of how the hell did you cope there without just shitting yourself as a newbie who'd never fought before, he said after a while you realize that you become part of a family, and when things get difficult, I'm not going to run because I want to protect the people around me. And that was what...
That's that traditional... You ask soldiers from any campaign, why would you fight? It's not for king country, queening country or whatever. It's for the guy who left you or the woman right of you. It's about the cohesiveness of the group, isn't it? And exactly the same over there, the sounds of it, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I asked most of them that because quite a lot, all of them really who were in the book, a few of them had been in hardcore combat situations before, but the majority had not. And that was a question that I was always interested in. And generally speaking, that was the answer you got. One or two did say that the skill that you learned essentially was being able to cope with the fear and being able to think straight and act straight when you were under pressure, which I guess would give you a huge advantage over somebody who wasn't. You should stress to your listeners, I'm not a soldier myself. So any kind of misinterpretations or that are in the book about soldiering experience are, down to me and me alone.
The term Scream Factory is used to describe and I might get this wrong, is it Yavorov? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yavorov is how you pronounce it,
base. And you highlight the significant vetting issues in the presence of eminently unqualified individuals. What were the most notable consequences of this initial lack of rigorous vetting on the Legion's early operations and reputation, and has it improved over time?
So right at the beginning of the war, to cut a long story short, the Legion didn't, it was created on the hoof overnight. They didn't really have any kind of organizational capacity to vet people properly. And therefore, all manner of people were turning up whose military qualifications were not scrutinized properly, people with criminal records as well, and other people who were eminently unsuitable for service. In terms of the impact it had, you had, I think, a certain amount of Walter Mittys characters going around telling Ukrainian soldiers or commanders that they had certain qualifications. They were ex-SAS or ex-Royal Marines or what have you. You can imagine the situation. And then coming unstuck in combat situations, or in some cases actually deserting the front lines in combat situations and leaving certain Ukrainian soldiers in the lurch. I think there was one or two examples of that early on where that happened. Very soon, the word spread that some of the foreigners, and we're talking about a minority, but some of the foreigners were bad apples and should not be trusted. Frankly, I think it's amazing if I was a Ukrainian commander, the idea of accepting any group of foreigners, let alone an unvetted bunch who've never fought together before and who didn't know each other from Adam 3 weeks previously, the idea of accepting any of those kind of people into my ranks for any kind of combat role where they might have to be relied upon to do a certain job, and therefore, and where I would be, where my own soldiers would be depending on them to a certain extent. I'd be amazed if any Ukrainian commander was willing to do that. And that's one of the problems that the foreigners found a lot, was just that there was a reluctance among a lot of the Ukrainian commanders to go anywhere near them, certainly when they were unproved.
Has that changed a bit now?
Yes, I mean, I think because of the organizational chaos at the beginning, a lot of the foreigners, rather than being recruited into sort of barracks, given a couple of weeks training and sort of put in a big all-foreigner unit and sent straight to the front, they languished in these barracks for ages, weeks, months on end, being told, we'll get you to the front sooner or later. And eventually they just bypassed the Legion altogether, formed their own little groups of people who they broadly trusted, whose records they could, you fought, you were in the paras in so-and-so a time, I know someone who knows you, that sort of thing. They would form their own little groups and basically shot themselves around on the front lines like labourers seeking work. And if they could earn the trust of certain commanders, then they did so. And, to some extent, I think you've got to hand it to people for being willing to do that, to be sort of inserting yourself into a battle where, people might not necessarily want you there. Has it improved? Well, I think the units who managed to do that successfully and earn the trust of Ukrainian commanders have built a reputation for themselves and are still there. I think a lot of the problems with the Legion are still there. Though I still hear stories of people going to fight in Ukraine who are signing up with other military units, but numerous cases of guys where you think, like, really, that doesn't sound like you don't sound like the person sort of person who should have been there. People with serious mental health problems, people with very little combat experience, etc., etc. And I think, rather unfortunately, the war needs people. It needs bodies, as it were, guys who are willing to turn up and fight. In the same way as Ukrainians are now taking people, draftees off,
like press ganging them, more or less, aren't they?
Conscription. In that same way, they're not going to be too fussy about the foreigners who turn up either. And also, from a data protection point of view, these days, you sort of try getting some foreigner who turns up, you say, like, prove to me that you've got a clean mental health record. I don't know where you're going to get that from. It's just not going to happen.
You mentioned earlier about, trying to think of the right word, the ruthlessness, I think, is probably the best word, of the Russian army. We've seen it over the years from Afghanistan, Chechnya. They don't play by any rules. And this has been experienced by captured volunteers who detail horrific torture and psychological manipulation in Russian captivity. What common threads or particularly disturbing patterns emerge from their accounts of interrogation and imprisonment? And how do these narratives impact you as a researcher?
Yeah, well, I think there's three of the volunteers in the book end up in Russian captivity in various different circumstances. One of the reasons I was keen to speak to them and get their accounts was just to get a bit of a change of pace of narrative, so that it wasn't just all battlefield stuff. Another, obviously, because it was going to be an extraordinarily tough ordeal. That gives you a real insight into what the Russians are like to be up against, and also there was no doubt about the veracity of their experiences, because most of these people had appeared on videos in Russian propaganda channels and so on. So there was absolutely no question that they were fabricating any of this. Their stories all followed a similar pattern, which was basically, after getting captured, they would often be roughed up by the soldiers they were with, a little bit, as in the soldiers who actually captured them, but nothing too bad at that point. I think there was a bit of like, yeah, you're a soldier, fine, we're all soldiers together here. They would then be taken to Russian black site prisons, usually in the separatist-controlled parts of eastern Ukraine. These are like unofficial jails that don't officially exist, and where they would be interrogated in very brutal fashion, be usually for about 5 weeks or so. They would just get beaten non-stop, music played at full blast, and be tortured with electricity, sometimes, electrocution, and also threatened with capital punishment as well. Really absolutely hideous ordeals. It was quite hard, actually, to know how, in some ways, to get those accounts out of people, because you do have to be careful about not making them relive their trauma too much. I mean, I was fairly blunt about it. As you said, look, tell me what you can. And none of the people that I interviewed, none of the three guys, seemed to have difficulty relaying it. I think they'd already relayed it to the British police or the American police or the FBI and various other investigators. So it wasn't too bad for them in that respect. What I did on occasions with one of the American volunteers, Alex Drucke, for example, I just said, let's focus on one particular incident, because when you're writing a book, you do want to kind of create sort of scenes in occasionally in very, very vivid, almost real-time detail, where you describe the look of the guy who's torturing them, the action almost second by second, the smell of the room, the movie scene detail. And so we just focused on one particular episode of his actual torture, which was the use of electricity, where he was tortured by a guy who he called Dead Eyes, because he said this guy's just had no soul in his eyes. And we tried to sort of get them to describe what the process of being tortured by electric shock was. I think that went reasonably well. On occasions, I would send him back the text I've written to sort of say, look, have you got anything else to add to this? Any other recollections? It's almost like a collaboration, really. Also, you want to make sure if you're describing someone talking about how they were tortured, you want to make sure you've got it right. You don't want any casual summaries or throw in observations that person thinks are not correct. That was kind of the technique we did for it. If any of them had sort of looked uncomfortable at things, I probably wouldn't have pushed it further, but none of them did, really. I also, having been kidnapped myself, that sort of came in handy a little bit. I wouldn't want to compare what I went through with what they went through because I was never tortured or anything, but it does give you a bit of an idea of certain questions to ask about, how do you cope with boredom? Like I was in a cave with no books, no newspapers, no radio, no stimulation whatsoever. They were in cells with no stimulation at all, no books, nothing. And that over time, that becomes one of the most difficult things to deal with, is just the absence of mental stimulation. How do you cope with that? How do you cope with those moments of utter despair? What do you do to sort of keep yourself going? And also to ask about the impact on their families, which I know from my own experience of being kidnapped, often pretty profound. And just the sense also of being in the hands of an enemy who was not going to play by any kind of rule book.
The Ukrainian foreign volunteers, they do have a legitimate legal status amongst the Ukrainian armed forces, but the Russians didn't recognise that, did they? They said they shouldn't be treated as prisoners of war. They were essentially mercenaries, that type of thing. Yeah,
that's right. And so I think all the foreigners, several of them were taken before a court in the Donetsk People's Republic, the separatist-held republic, and formally told that they were going to be charged as mercenaries and face the death penalty. If I had been them, I'd have thought, like, well, that's it. I really can't see why that's not going to happen. Quite how they coped with that, with the privations, with the torture, the beating, and the prospect of the death penalty hanging over them, I really don't know. I do know one or two of them made plans to commit suicide even if they had been held for another year. Just, there was no point in facing that kind of ongoing limbo. And really, you do your best to describe stuff like that. But I think that there's a sort of certain point where the depths of human despair and misery in those situations are hard to capture in words. These guys.
I know a couple of them have been actually done briefings to the British Army about what happened during the periods of capture with the Russians. So I think the British Army's keen to learn. And to be honest, what you described there, though, is a couple of things. It's firstly, black sites, use of noise. So we've done that. We, the West, have done that. So it's not unusual. But I don't think anything you described there is a surprise to me from what I've read about the Russians in the past.
All of them seem to have either been taught conduct under captivity stuff or certainly did a very good adaptation of them. They all sort of thought on their feet quite well. All three of the ones that I've interviewed now, are back out and leading functional lives, which frankly amazes me.
We talked about the chaos of the early days, and you extensively described that chaos and often disorganised nature of the Legion in the book, with complaints about incompetent commanders, poor logistics, and even instances of looting. In what ways did these internal challenges, described by one person as herding cats in battle, sometimes pose a greater threat or difficulty to the volunteers and the external enemy themselves?
Well, yeah, certainly. I think this is one of the things that began to intrigue me as I started researching the book, was like, what on earth can it be like to be fighting alongside people that you've never met before, whose combat skills are completely unknown, whose formal combat qualifications are often completely unknown, who may have been bullshitting a bit about their formal combat qualifications, and also may have all the kind of formal qualifications in the world, but when it comes to it, when the shit hits the fan, you're not really going to know how they're going to cope, because they may well be as inexperienced as you. Now, I think the one thing in Ukraine was that you could be certain that it was going to, get nasty at certain points. So I think it was extraordinarily difficult for the volunteers who were going out there. I compare it a little bit to working as a foreign correspondent, where sometimes in war zones, when things are kind of really tough, there's strength in numbers, and you'll team up with a couple of other people, you'll travel in a convoy or whatever, and that often means banding up with people you don't know. Often when you do that, you think, like, I just hope this person's going to cope all right if we get into trouble, and you really got no idea. And we're talking stress levels, danger levels, a fraction of what the volunteers go through. So, a lot of the volunteers used to say to me that the people they're most wary of on the battlefield is not the Russians, but the fellow volunteers. And they are extremely wary of each other. I think what happens is they build up levels of trust. Soldiers, in my experience, are very good at doing background checks on each other. There's, I'm sure if you met somebody from your rough age group out in Ukraine, you would know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who was in their unit, or who could probably vouch for them or otherwise. So I think
what you describe in the book about how these foreign volunteers form themselves into these small ad hoc units, I see quite a few parallels with private military companies in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there's a lot of cowboy PMCs out there, and you'd have seen them as a journalist in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. And I do see is that a fair comparison, that these guys are chasing adventure, chasing the buck? Some of them are cowboys, some of them are very good.
To some extent, I met quite a lot of the PMC people out in Iraq and Afghanistan. And first of all, this is a completely different war, because these guys in Ukraine, they are fighting. The PMCs in Iraq and Afghanistan were purely defensive, and it was a purely a passive role. They were not supposed to get involved in combat. Most of them, though, they were working for big companies generally, like Aegis or Blackwater, and which were run along military lines. And if they stepped out of line, then sorry, your contract's terminated. You're out on your arse. Whereas in Ukraine, there's a commander I write about in the book, Daniel Burke. He was one of the early people who set up effectively his own unit, the Dark Angels, a group of about a dozen foreign volunteers. And he was nominally in command. But, he said he had no formal redress over anybody in his unit other than getting rid of them if things went wrong. That, I think, must have been pretty difficult, because in a normal military structure, you've got the army
formal discipline code
to back you up. Discipline procedures, a couple of big NCOs or sergeants, and some burly squaddies to come along if somebody steps out of line. Whereas in Ukraine, I think a lot of the commanders are basically, they are running the show through force of personality alone. I think they usually have one or two other people who will back them up. But really, if things go wrong, and they do sometimes, then they're kind of on their own. And that's...
You're also talking about that discipline side. There's a ongoing, not investigation, but there's an ongoing mystery around the death of a Brit volunteer out there who was found in a lake with his hands bound behind his back.
That's right, yeah. He features in the book a gentleman by the name of Jordan Chadwick.
Again, do you have any idea? I can't remember from the book what exactly happened there, but do you reckon that was somewhere that was a violent disagreement?
I'll be careful what I say here, because it is still an ongoing investigation. I have written about it in the book, and also in a subsequent magazine article for the Daily Telegraph that came out just a month ago. But everything that was said in that was carefully run through our lawyers. In essence, yes, there was a British volunteer by the name of Jordan Chadwick. He served out there for about 9 months and was then found dead in a lake, in a reservoir, with his arms tied behind his back. It was not close to the combat zone, so the presumption is that he was not a victim due to some enemy action. It is understood that he had some sort of dispute with fellow volunteers in his unit, or possibly another unit, shortly prior to his death. There was some sort of punch-up, and then 48 hours later he was found dead in this reservoir, and the presumption is the two events are connected. I have not yet got to the bottom of who did it. There's fingers being pointed everywhere. The Ukrainian police did investigate it, though, and they have made no arrests. Depending on your point of view, that either means that they've not been able to find out who did it, or that whoever did it, that they value the soldiers out there too much, to really want to know what happened. That is one of the theories, and that at a time when the Russians are bearing down on them, if somebody is killed as a result of a brawl one night, then the Ukrainian military command is tempted to turn a blind eye. But I should stress that we've not really got to the bottom of it yet. But yeah, it's a very concerning case that something like that could happen, that it appears to be something to do. Certainly there's a strong suggestion it might have been fellow volunteers involved, and that nobody has been brought to
a foreign volunteer is seen as more expendable. Well, it's a very harsh statement to make there.
I think to some extent that is a story you'll hear some of the volunteers say. Early on in the book, there's a volunteer called by the name of Stephen Wilson, who serves down in Mykolaiv, and he recounts a meeting that he had with some Ukrainian commanders, where the conversation was held in Ukrainian, but one of his fellow volunteers, unbeknownst to the Ukrainian commanders, spoke Ukrainian or Russian, spoke the local tongue. And after the meeting, his Ukrainian comrade or his fellow volunteer said to him, "Do you know what was said in that meeting?" He said, "Do you know what they called us?" I said, What did they call us?" And he said, apparently they'd been referred to as free meat. Wow. Yeah, I think you can guess what that meant, as in, yeah, here's some guys that we can send out in the front lines, and if they die, then so be it. A lot of the volunteers were used mainly for reconnaissance work, which I think is something that they were quite good at. Apparently the British military are quite good at that sort of thing, so it played to their skill set. And it also played to some extent to their appetite for getting stuck in. Most of them did not want, I don't think, to just sit around in a trench all day getting shelled. They wanted to test themselves in combat. And so if the Ukrainians said, look, we need a position checking out a mile into no man's land, or we need there's a Russian observation post we want sort of to get eyes on, we need volunteers. The foreigners are naturally going to be the people who, I
suppose, operating in smaller groups with a lot of time self-selected themselves. It's an ideal task for them in some respect.
Yes, and I think to some extent they would volunteer to do that because they wanted to get stuck in. I think possibly it did mean that they were. It was just that scenario could also lend itself to the Ukrainian commanders saying, do you know what? We could do with knowing what's going on over there. If we send some guys over there, then the Russians will open fire if there are any Russians over there. And we've got some Brits who are willing to do it. And so it might have led to certain situations where the Brits were being used for things that the foreigners were, that the Ukrainians were not themselves willing to do. Yeah. And certainly I think there were cases of people claiming that they'd been used as cannon fodder, basically, sadly. And that was an ongoing difficulty, point of contention between the Brits and the Ukrainians. And it did lead to sometimes to, sort of fist fights and other things, yeah.
There's quite a mixed picture being explained here. And these foreign fighters, often in small, often ad hoc units, do you think they've made a tangible difference at the tactical or operational level?
Because they're mainly in small units, I think you're talking about tactical rather than strategic gains, yes. If you'd had big battalions of 3,000 international legionnaires all fighting different theatres, in single theatres of combat, you might have had headlines sort of saying, the International Brigade has taken the town of Pokrovsk, or has played the crucial role in the battle of, this place or that place, yeah. There's not been that because these units are too small, I think, to do that. I suspect what it is a position taken here, some territory, well defended there, a good judgment call occasionally here and there. The units that have stayed stuck in, and I want to emphasize that the majority of them are there to do their best. The book focuses quite a bit on all the screamers and the nutcases, obviously, because they are a big talking point out there amongst all the volunteers. But the majority of them are there to try and do the best they can. They are held in high regard, some of them, by their Ukrainian comrades, and you can tell that by the way that the foreigners talk about the Ukrainians too. There are friendships that have been made there for life. I think the biggest contribution they make probably is in terms of morale, make the Ukrainians feel like they're not fighting alone, and that there are other men and women out there around the world who see see the war in the same way as they do and are prepared to come, not just to, give humanitarian aid or whatever, but actually to fight and suffer and in some cases die alongside them. And I think that's a big morale boost. And while you and I have talked a lot about the tensions that sometimes come on the battlefield, which I'm sure come on most battlefields, for the average Ukrainian citizen in the street, they see foreigners wandering around, sitting in cafes and staying in hotels, dressed in Ukrainian military uniforms, but with speaking foreign tongues and with their little foreign patches, lapel patches with a Union Jack or a Baltic flag or American flag or whatever. And I think, there's people around here, that there are other people who believe in us. And the foreigners often talk about, the good reception they get out there, people buying them coffees in cafes and drinks in bars and so on. So, the morale thing is probably the biggest thing more than the combat. But I wouldn't want to say that combat contribution has been insignificant. I'm sure the Ukrainians have learnt a lot from the foreigners, and indeed the foreigners have probably learnt to a certain extent from the Ukrainians.
Yeah, so it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? Because I can't remember what the recruitment age. You've got to be above the age of 25. I think they lowered the recruitment age to 25 recently.
In Ukraine, the recruitment age is 25 for Ukrainian citizens. In the Legion, I'm not sure if there is an age.
Do any of the foreigners talk to you about things like they're there fighting for Ukraine, but you've got... I understand why Zelensky's had that age limit because they're worried about future demographics, that type of thing. But also, I was reading the other day there that 600,000 Ukrainians who are eligible to fight have left the country. I was just wondering, was there any talk about that paradox between these foreigners coming in and Ukrainians not prepared to fight for their own country?
I think at the beginning of the war, one of the reasons why so many foreigners went was because they saw that the majority of Ukrainian men, or a lot of Ukrainian men, including civilians, were getting up and fighting. A lot of the volunteers I spoke to, trained soldiers themselves, they thought, hey, here these people, they're having a go. Credit to them. I'm going to go and I'm going to give them some expert advice for the guys who've never held a gun before, or for the women, indeed. So generally speaking, the impression is that the Ukrainians are a fighting nation, and that's why we want to be alongside them. Of course, there are young men who don't want to join the draft. Again, probably find that minority in any country. I've not really asked many foreign fighters about it. I've certainly asked some of the Ukrainian fighters what they think about their own countrymen not serving when they have to, because obviously the foreigners are there out of choice. You'd expect some really blood-curdling quotes on that subject about how these guys are letting down the country and how they ought to be strung up by the bollocks when they, if they're ever caught or whatever. Actually, a lot of the time it's just like, look, if these guys don't want to fight, there'd be no use anyway. We'd rather not have them there. You've got your heart's got to be in it. That's where it stands.
That's a great point, and it's an interesting perspective because I think there's some of those guys have been in the front lines over a couple of years. I think I read somewhere the average age of a Ukrainian fighter is about 38 or 40 or something.
Apparently, yeah, I think 43. I think was the last I heard. But yeah, that it's not entirely a young man's war of 19 and 20-year-olds, although there are a lot of young Ukrainians who have gone and fought clearly and who've died, sadly. I've written a few pieces over time about people dodging the draft, but I do often think, like, well, what would I have done in that situation? Can you say with your hand on heart that you would have served and that you wouldn't have run off to Europe instead? I don't know.
The book touches on the difficult readjustment process of volunteers returning home, citing issues like PTSD, lack of understanding from civilians, and minimum official support. Just rang so many bells for me, this, about our own experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and other wars where veterans seem to get the same treatment regardless of what country they're in. What in your view are the most pressing needs for these returning volunteers, and what kind of support systems are currently lacking in their home countries? There was at one point a serious debate about their status from their home countries, well, certainly in UK, and going to fight in Ukraine. But whereas a British Army veteran has access to X amount of services, I would imagine apart from going to see their GP, a lot of these guys are not going to get any help at all.
No, just to be clear, as most of your listeners probably already know, the British government does not support people going out to fight in Ukraine. It advises against it. Nobody, to my knowledge, has been prosecuted for fighting in Ukraine, but it's certainly not something the government encourages. And yeah, there are no official, you're not going to get the kind of support that you would if you were an British Army veteran returning from Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not quite sure where organisations like Help for Heroes or the big official charities stand on assisting people who've never been in the armed forces, for example, who've gone out to Ukraine and then come back traumatized, whether they would get help or not. I think that is a bit of a grey area. Certainly, there are other ways in which returning volunteers, it's a very different situation. I mean, for a start, you don't come home to a ticker tape parade or any kind of warm words of congratulation from Sir Keir Starmer or anybody else. You've been out fighting usually on your own, and back in your own hometown, there's going to be very few other people who will have been through the same experience, unlike a soldier who maybe returns to a garrison town in the UK and who's got lots of other peers who've been through the same thing. Often they'll find that they're the only person in their county or in their entire region of England who's been out to Ukraine. They don't always have a huge amount of family support either, because, as I said at the beginning, a lot of them have gone out there against the explicit advice of their families. So they come back. If they come back with mental health problems or injury problems, there are going to be, quite often members of their family saying, like, so it's all your own bloody fault, son. You shouldn't have gone out there in the first place. For example, in terms of the sort of lack of general support, one soldier I interviewed, Andrew Hill, who was an ex-infantryman, fairly well-qualified soldier, who went out and was taken prisoner of war and duly tortured in captivity and so on. He spent 4 months in Russian captivity and then was released as part of a prisoner exchange. When he got back, he described to me how he suffered all the sort of disadvantages of being famous, as in he had people coming up to him and, recognizing him in the street and so on, which really didn't need at that time. Not everybody was supportive either. He discovered that there was a surprising amount of people who were basically pro-Russian or at least very, very neutral about the war, living in his own area, which he said was not particularly pleasant. So there was that issue. At one point, he went for help with an organisation called Man Down, which is a fairly well-respected mental health charity. Men talk about their mental health issues and personal problems, rather than bottling it up. He describes in the book how he went to that, and I think it was his first night, so he was encouraged to open up, and he described how he'd been out in Ukraine and then he'd been captured and tortured and so on. And there were, he said you could just hear a pin drop in the room, and everybody's like, "What?" And the rest of them are all there just with very normal, everyday problems of joblessness, drink or drug problems, depression.
May as well have been on Mars with his experiences, wouldn't he?
Yeah, and exactly. He just felt like, it was no criticism of the group. He just felt like, this is not the right place for me. I think they were all fascinated. It was like, it was supposed to be a session where everybody contributed. And I think he chatted for almost an hour and a half, I think, or something like that, because everybody was just like, oh, this is really interesting. And it may well be that it put their own personal problems in perspective a bit, but that was not what he needed. I did remember thinking he could have gone to a veterans charity, but there would have been no veterans charity that would have been able to, would have had any experience of like counselling people who had been through what he had been through, the Russian KGB torture machine. You'd have to go back to, God knows, World War II or something like that to kind of find anybody with those sorts of ordeals. So there's an issue about the institutional capacity of our soldiers' aftercare systems to actually provide people who've got relevant experience to act as counsellors in these situations. Andrew, in the end, actually ended up going back to Ukraine because he felt that as a soldier he'd sort of fallen off the horse, and he wanted to go back and see if he could still cope because it was central to his sort of soldiering identity. He duly did. He had a much more routine tour. For Andrew, I think it was a case of sort of wanting to prove to himself, to conquer the very understandable personal demons that he got as a result of what happened. You think of combat, it's like an itch that they'll scratch and then it's done. And it seems to be an itch that just gets worse. And a lot of them, I thought you'll go to Ukraine, you'll do a term of combat, box ticked, and then you'll feel like you can go home and that'll be that. And yet a lot of them have gone back, somewhat to my surprise, for second and third terms, tours of duty. One's been at Douglas Cartner, the guy who never fought before. He's still out there. He's been out there 3 years now. And I think they develop a second family out there. They enjoy the combat. I think the adrenaline they get from it, I dare say, proves addictive. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it, basically. And they find a sense of purpose out there and a sense of family and camaraderie that they often don't have back home. And
do you recognise that as a war-torn journalist?
No, not really. If I'm absolutely honest, I mean, you'll read a lot in the newspapers about war zone junkies and so on. Most people who cover wars as foreign correspondents, it's only a small amount of the job. Often you're doing stuff about, the meltdown of the Eurozone or immigration or covering peace summits like the one that we've got in Alaska at the moment involving Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So it's only a small part of the job. You do get a very few people who really push it on the front lines who kind of get hooked on it. But I'm not like that. I enjoy it a bit, but you're not doing it at anything like the kind of levels that these people are doing it at, where I guess your entire nervous system is getting completely charged with these sort of life and death moments all the time, where nothing really matters in life except getting through and emerging unscathed. And I'm sure some of your listeners will be familiar with that sort of experience. It's not one that I think most reporters, except a very few real combat nutcases, who often started out life wanting to be soldiers in the first place, actually, and who, for whatever reason,
I think there's a simplicity to being in a war zone, or as a soldier being an operational tour. All you need to do is eat, sleep, and stay alive. And if you're in a command position, look after your blokes. You don't have to worry about paying bills. You don't have to about going to the supermarket. And I think there is a simplicity there that some soldiers struggle to adapt to the routine and dare say the bullshit of everyday life. And I think that's probably an attraction for some of these guys as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I would say, yeah. And one or two of Stephen Wilson, who's one of the guys who, by his own admission, he had a tough upbringing and his home life was not great after he left the army, having served in Afghanistan. He said, being in Afghanistan, that was when my life felt it had purpose and meaning. Afterwards, I sort of lost that sense of purpose. Ukraine has given me that back. And he felt, he was his best self out there because he had to, act in a certain way to survive and so on. And he says the challenge now is being back in the UK and trying to maintain that sense of purpose in life, but just in a civilian manner, yeah.
So mad, bad and brave, what was the biggest category?
Just mad and brave. I mean, there were a few bad ones out there as well. I'd challenge anybody to be out there who didn't have a degree of bravery. I think if they were really not very brave, they ran pretty soon the moment like the big bombs started landing. Most of them, if you ask their families, there's a bit of madness in there as well, definitely. So it's probably about 50-50, yeah. No one's objected to the title yet and said, "What do you mean I'm mad? I'm just brave," or whatever. I think they all seem to quite like the title, which I wish I'd.
I think it's enough descriptive.
Publishing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You suggest that a more organised legion, potentially with discreet arm's length help from Ukraine's allies, could have become a much more formidable fighting force. So based on your own research and experiences, if you could implement 3 key changes to the Legion's structure or support, what would they be to maximise its effectiveness and minimise its challenges?
Yeah, I mean, this is me going on my own sort of like personal sort of soapbox here a little bit, and some of your listeners will probably have much more intelligent takes on this. But I did think that because of the lack of organisation in the Legion at the beginning, it generated a lot of bad headlines, and a lot of people probably avoided signing up. Even 3 years in, it has been all a bit chaotic. I do think, and a few other people have said this to me, that if the Western powers had been able to cooperate with the Ukrainians a bit more, sent out a few experienced NCOs and senior commanders to sort of run the Legion effectively, weed out the bad apples, ask for proper vetting, and so on, and then also provided enough translators and interpreters who are essential in these situations to make things run smoothly. The Legion might have generated much better headlines and been a much more efficient force. As a result, it might have attracted far more people. And rather than a Legion where the guesstimates, because the Ukrainian military doesn't specify how many there are, where we have only maybe 10,000 fighting there, you might have had 50,000 or 100,000 or something like that. And, people might think, well, that's an awful lot. But if you compare it to the Spanish Civil War, which was the last big mobilization of its sort, where George Orwell and people like that went to fight against Franco's fascists, you had 35,000, 40,000 went out there. And that was at a time when it was a lot harder to move around the world and so on. And also, if you compare it to the number of people who went to fight for ISIS, there was 35, 40,000 of them too. So I think the Legion could potentially have attracted a lot more people than it did. And the other point I would make was the West has a track record in being able to train up armies from scratch these days. We did it in Iraq and Afghanistan through private firms like I think it was Dying Corps and Blackwater and these PMCs that we were talking about earlier. Outfits like that to have trained up the Legion, possibly in Poland or somewhere like that, and given it organizational structure and edge that it needed to make it much more effective. It would have been politically sensitive because Putin would have said, oh, you're creating your own foreign mercenary group. He did, by the way, with Wagner. We've been supplying Ukraine with weapons anyway and training their own soldiers over here.
That's just symptomatic of the West's approach to this war.
Yeah, I mean, this is, what I've been just telling you is my sort of bar stool argument on it. And I'm sure some of your listeners would be interested to hear from any of them who might have views on why this would not be possible. I just think it seems a bit of a failure of imagination, really, on the part of the West to sort of see like there's hundreds of thousands of trained ex-soldiers who will go out there and volunteer. And it will be hard for Putin to argue that this is a Western army because they'll be from all over the world.
What I meant to ask you one of the previous questions was, we talked about volunteers coming back here and not getting any support. If they're killed in service fighting for Ukraine, do they get any death in service benefits? Or if they lose an arm, do they get any sort of pension?
They do. I mean, I think a lot of the time that money has not been forthcoming, not necessarily because of any bad faith on the Ukrainian side. I think just the Ukrainian military bureaucracy is still somewhat Soviet in its organization. And if a soldier goes missing in action, which often means he's just been killed, but they've not been able to retrieve the body from no man's land, it can often be 6 months before court proceedings can start in Ukraine to have somebody legally declared dead. Also, I think a lot of families have not, the money is not really part of the conversation in this anyway. Very few of the volunteers, certainly the Westerners, have gone out there because of the salaries. You're getting about $600 a month basic pay. You get 3 or 4 times that if you're in proper combat, but then that's proper combat pay. That's not all the time. And even so, that's still not amazing money. So, if they want to earn money, they'd be staying at home in the UK and just earning a minimum wage. Or indeed, as a lot of them do, the close protection security circuit working, for PMCs in somewhere like Iraq or Somalia, where they can earn 10 times what they'd be earning in Ukraine.
What is your view on the war now, and what do you think the future holds for Ukraine? It's coincidental that today we're recording this just as Trump and Putin are meeting in Alaska.
It's very hard to see what's going to come out of these talks. There's been 3 rounds of talks since Trump took office already, none of which have yielded anything whatsoever. The mood music around these talks is that these are going to be the kind of where things are finally going to start happening, because Trump has sort of put his credibility on the line a bit more and has said, like, Putin needs to start doing things or he's going to face sanctions. So reputations are more at stake either side now than they were before. Having said that, there is very little common ground between the Russians and the Ukrainians in terms of what they want. The Russians want large swathes of eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't really want to give it to them. So it's going to be a very hard sell for President Zelensky to his people back home. I think if they do get any kind of agreement on possibly certain bits of, I think it'll amount to areas that the Russians already hold, the Russians being allowed to keep, although the Ukrainians not being expected to actually legally recognize that territory, just simply to agree not to contest it militarily anymore. And I think the Americans will do the same. It will be de facto recognition, not de jure.
That's sort of similar to what happened in South Korea, that have a DMZ.
The key thing from the Ukrainian perspective will be that this territory is still legally recognized as theirs. That's probably the way it will pan out. There are certainly a lot of people think, well, like the Ukrainians may want the territory back, that they're not at the moment regaining turf. They're losing it, albeit very, very slowly. But they're not in a position to regain their land. They're also
demographics are against them, aren't they?
Something like 69% of Ukrainians now say that they would be willing to support some sort of peace deal if it meant an end to the war. That's a sort of very broad statement, and it depends a lot on the specifics. But that's a great deal more than, say, 6 months into the war, where I think the figure was around only 25% of Ukrainians. That some sort of arrangement like that will happen. And to some extent, I think there is a sort of, some diplomats seem to think that if Trump, for all it seems distasteful for Trump to be pushing a deal on the Ukrainians, it allows the Ukrainians to blame somebody else for acceding to a territorial deal, a shit sandwich that they really don't want to eat, because a lot of them are going to be thinking like, my neighbour, my comrade, my uncle, my son, my sons, plural, died for this war, and now we're giving territory away to those Russians. That's a really hard thing to do, but perhaps the only way to do it is to say, oh, it's because of that idiot Trump. He forced us to, and we needed the weapon. Without his weapons, we couldn't have carried on. But I think more long term, the Ukrainians will be seeking to basically become self-sufficient militarily, which they're quite well on the way to doing. Europe's job in all of this, while they're effectively on the sidelines in the current negotiations, will be to ensure that whatever happens once some sort of deal is reached, that the Ukraine is looked after economically and militarily and becomes effectively a Slavic Israel, really, I think. But I'd also preface everything I've just said with saying that, these talks may end up coming to nothing. If there's one thing that we've seen in this war, it swings one way or the other all the time, and you've really got no idea how it may pan out, because the two sides fundamentally not really quite at the stage where they're prepared to give up fighting.
I'll close off with what I opened with. Even though I've read your book and we've had this conversation, I really am still none the wiser as to why a foreign volunteer would put themselves in the front lines in a war like that when it's not their own country. I really just don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, for some of them, it's giving their life a sense of purpose that it perhaps didn't have in the UK. I think for a lot of them, that's definitely true. They miss the camaraderie of army life, and that this gives them that back. They enjoy the adventure. They enjoy the opportunity to be in a family and to put themselves to a certain test. I think quite a lot of them actually talk about resettling in Ukraine once the war has ended. As volunteers, they're offered Ukrainian citizenship. They can resettle with their families there. And, it's a nice country. It's a beautiful country, and it offers certain other advantages. I mean, if you ask the average foreign military volunteer, what do you like about Ukraine? It's like beautiful country, great food, hot women, nice, cheap housing. For somebody, a lot of people on an average ex-soldier's wage is important these days. You can't get a house here, but you can buy a plot of land or a flat or whatever you want in Ukraine. Also, a lot of them, they're not that explicit about it, but I think they like being in a country where warrior values are still celebrated, and not just celebrated, but actively needed. They need people like them. Whereas, a lot of your listeners will say ex-soldiers are not always treated with total respect over here. A lot of people who end up on Civvy Street after time in the army, they feel they're regarded in a certain way as, he's sort of macho ex-soldier type. It's sometimes tied in with dialogues about
or damaged goods. It's most soldiers, regardless of what they did in the service, don't fall into that category. They're just normal people, just going about a normal life.
No, for a lot of them, it's like Ukraine is a place where no one's kind of questions me or my motivations, and people champion the same things that I do. And you walk down the street in Ukraine and you'll see military posters everywhere. It's quite a militaristic culture anyway, as a lot of ex-Soviet countries are. So for them, that's important too, I think. Yeah.
Where can listeners get a copy of the book, and what's your next project?
You can buy it on Amazon or from the HarperCollins website, or it's available in bookshops as well, and probably will be for some time. So basically, any of the usual outlets. If anybody has trouble getting hold of it, look at my my Twitter page. It's Colin Freeman 99. I can direct them, but really, Amazon and local bookshops are probably the easiest bet. Yeah, it'll also be coming out in paperback sometime in the new year. If you don't fancy humping a big hardback around.
If you can talk about it, do you have any new projects in the pipeline?
Not really at the moment. No, I've only just finished doing the book earlier this year, and then you tend to spend quite a lot of time trying to promote it afterwards, doing book festivals, book talks. Because it only came out last month, I'm still focusing on that. I may go back to Ukraine again sometime in the autumn if possible. And my intention is to sort of see the war out, as it were. I wouldn't mind doing an updated version of the book or even a sequel. Indeed, if there's any volunteers out there who are listening, I'm always interested to speak to them either on or off record and just sort of get a vague outline of what they've been up to, because it depends on how the sales of this one go and whether there is appetite for any sort of sequel book. But I would like to think there would be, and I know there's, every time I speak to like a volunteer, even in a casual conversation, something always comes up in terms of what they've done that made me think, Jesus Christ, I wish I'd had that in the book, But otherwise, if anybody's, I'm generally fairly happy to sort of try and do book talks and book clubs and things. If anybody buys the book and reads it with their mates or anything, I'm happy to sort of try, within reason, or sort of travel to sort of talk to them about it and so on. Because I've enjoyed talking to you tonight, and I sort of generally do enjoy talking.
Well, you said you've got a website there. I'll put a link to your website or your Twitter feed or whatever in the show notes, and people can just directly look at that and get in touch with you via there if they want. Yeah. Okay, so this is always interested in what my guests pick for Desert Island Dits, Colin. So first of all, what book have you picked?
This was difficult. I thought of trying to pick a book about the war in Iraq, but eventually I picked An Evil Cradling. Brian Keenan, for younger listeners, was a university lecturer who was kidnapped in Beirut in the late 1980s during the Beirut sort of hostage crisis, or the Lebanon hostage crisis, held by an Islamic militia for 5 years, much of that time on his own, and some of it, I think, in conjunction with Terry Waite, he was held alongside. Can't quite remember. But anyway, the book is about his how he coped being in captivity for that length of time. Curiously, I read it, I think it was my very first time on a newspaper work experience at the Edinburgh Evening News. I went to see him talk about his book at an event at the Edinburgh Festival and wrote a piece about it, little knowing that it would come in as quite a handy survival guide.
Did you find yourself thinking back to that book and getting sort of little tip that you could recall?
Yeah. And totally. And I've read several other books by ex-hostages since then. And I would urge anybody who's, if you're a soldier and any kind of job where you're likely to face, or an aid worker, and you're likely to potentially face the possibility of being kidnapped or illegally detained, having read a few books about what it's like is really helpful. Yeah. But the reason I mentioned Brian's book is that my kidnapping ended after 6 weeks. And I remember thinking, I was pretty much at my wit's end by then, but we'd sort of been told about halfway through that we were going to get released in another week or two. And then towards the end, the plan to release us was cancelled, and they said, we're going to hold you for another year. And I think as a result of having been told that we were going to get released, I sort of let my mind go a bit mentally. And when we were told we were going to have to do another year, I remember suddenly thinking, oh my God, how the hell am I going to cope with this? And then literally a few hours later that afternoon, they said, no, it's all right, the plan's back on to release you. I said, oh, thank God. But I remember thinking afterwards, I would have had to sort of develop a sort of level of mental discipline to cope with that I had not developed thus far in captivity. And basically I got out, when, I was given an early bath in my hostage taking experience, and Brian was not done, was not so. And that's really when a hostage sort of experience begins, is at the point where you're, as I already was, like you're on your arse, you're exhausted, you're mentally frazzled, and feeling like you can go on no longer. And then that's the point where people say, right, now here is where the journey begins. After you've already run the marathon, it's like, here's the marathon, and it's a marathon of marathons. So yeah, I think Brian's book is beautifully written as well. So I would recommend that to anybody, really. Yeah.
And film?
Yeah, Salvador, which is, I think 1985, stars James Woods, who's always been one of my favourite actors. It's James Woods as a war photographer in El Salvador, almost the war reporter's fantasy film. He's incredibly glamorous, rakish, driving down to the war zone from the US in his open-topped car, smoking a joint.
Hunter S. Thompson,
it's basically Hunter S. Thompson in the war zone, yeah. Looking incredibly cool and glamorous, and getting loads of really good stuff. And so absolutely nothing like reality whatsoever. But I think I know from a few other people that there are many colleagues of my era who sort of, when you occasionally have those barroom conversations about what made you decide to do this, it's like, oh, saw Salvador, didn't I? It looked fun. But I should say that he wears one of those sort of war reporters, photographers, utility vests, those sort of khaki things where you can put lots of sort of rolls of film and so on. I got one of those for when I went to Iraq, and I remember looking myself in the mirror, and I looked basically like a posh farmer in a waistcoat. I did not look like a war reporter at all. So I think I sort of discarded it after that.
And luxury item?
Again, this is hard. Yeah, booze, I think. Lager and red wine, if possible. When I got released from Somalia, the paper did do an interview with me where they said, what was it that you first wanted when you got out of when you were released? And I said, a pint of lager. Well, I think I should have said a phone call to my family or my girlfriend or something like that. But I've noticed quite a few other people have sort of said that as their opening comment.
My choice this episode is The Mad and the Brave, Colin's book, The Untold Story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, primarily because I am fascinated by what drives people to go and fight for another country. And one of the reasons I do that is I know the importance of being a motivated soldier. I served in Northern Ireland and places like that, and I remember when Telek won the Iraq War, 2004, when it was. I remember I was sat beside an officer I knew when we flew out there, and we were discussing the legitimacy about what we were doing, and we were both very, very sceptical about why we were going out there and the whole weapons of mass destruction piece. And all right, with hindsight now, it proved to be like a fool's errand. But I think that also has fed into why I wanted to read your book, because even as a serving soldier, going to where my country told me, I was very sceptical about what I was getting into. And I think reading your book, what you can't get away with is the guys who you talk to, it's that idealism I think is quite strange for me. And you touched on that quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them do sort of seem to say, like, I'm a trained soldier, and this is a big war where there's never been as black and white a cause as this in decades. This is as black and white a cause as Hitler invading Czechoslovakia or Poland or whatever. And if I'm ever going to fight in another person's war or another country's war, this is it. I think it got to the point where for some of them it was like, look, I'm a trained soldier. What's the point of skills when people are dying abroad? Now, obviously, there are a lot of trained soldiers in the UK, and the vast majority of them did not go out to Ukraine. So for most of them, I think there was usually other factors at play as well. Also, though, soldiering's the only job in the world where you train every day for years and may never get the chance to put your skills into practice. A bit like being a reporter who never writes for a newspaper, or a pilot who never flies a plane. So I consider the motivations that they have. It is still extraordinary.
No, you're absolutely right, mate. It's absolutely extraordinary, and I do recommend your book, and go out there and read up on why these people went and fought and served in Ukraine with the Foreign Legion over there. Colin, great to have you on, mate. Really enjoyed that. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guest for coming on, and to you, the podcast listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. Finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.